I want to introduce you later. I'll talk to you later. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. It's like my daughter's old kindergarten class. You try again. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you. Great. Welcome, everyone. I'm Sarah Rosen-Mortel, and I have the great honor and privilege of being the president of the Urban Institute. I want to thank those of you who are here with us today, and I also want to welcome those of you who are on our online audience for a discussion of the federal role in higher education. For those of you who are social media fans, let me encourage you to use your phones not to check your email, but rather instead to join the conversation with the people in the room and online by using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And I'll notice that if you had the agenda, either on the website or when you came in, you'll notice that the speakers' handles are on the agenda, so I encourage you to use those as you're having your conversations online. So we're here today to do something unusual in this town these days, which is to have a bipartisan conversation. The goal of the conversation is to think about how can the federal government most effectively serve the needs of students and the country without stifling innovation or creating undue burdens on our institutions of higher education. Since its inception, higher ed has always been facilitated by the government, whether it was the creation of public colleges, funding of university-based research, and since the Higher Education Act of 1965, government has provided broad-based funding for the students to increase their access to education and to promote educational attainment for the nation, clearly good for the overall economy if more of Americans are able to advance themselves through education. The federal role in higher education has grown more over the last 2 decades, and today a new administration and the Congress has the opportunity, if they choose to take it, to strengthen policies that support students and the institutions of higher education. For this project, Urban brought together a bipartisan group of scholars and policy analysts and asked them to create a series of memos to the policymakers that were rooted in both an understanding of the importance of the federal role in higher education and an understanding of the limits of the federal role. I want to recognize the Lumina Foundation for their funding of this memos and the event here today. And let me just also take this moment to point you to, if you haven't already seen it, a website also built with their support, which is called Understanding College Affordability. It's something I'm very proud of that the team led by Sandy Baum here put together. It's accessible to a whole range of different audiences and just has a wealth of everything from the actual data itself to sort of helpful guides to help people understand how people pay for college, also a Lumina product. We're at an interesting moment. There is the potential, we'll see if we think policymakers will take it up, for reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. There are growing concerns about college affordability. If nothing else, the last presidential cycle demonstrated to us the degree to which that is on, that at least political actors believe that is on the minds of citizens, I think because it is. And even as there are some who wonder about whether college is the right path for them, and even as we work to improve alternative pathways to good paying jobs, we also are cognizant of the role that college credentials do play in creating well-paying careers for many Americans. So we must continue to elevate the debate around higher education policy and seek to ensure that programs that are created both support students and institutions and that they can be structured in a way that maximizes benefits for both. And these memos were designed to find ideas that can bridge the partisan divide with those objectives in mind. The authors come from a diverse ideological set of perspectives, but interestingly, they came to agree on a lot of topics. Their sense of shared goals and shared direction, to me, is promising for the next era of federal policy in higher education, and that is ultimately, at the Urban Institute, our purpose. We try to bring evidence to bear on pressing issues like student debt repayment, accreditation, improvement of financial aid programs like the Pell Grant, and more, and to provide data, research, and analysis that help leaders find solutions. In these memos, the Urban Institute has worked with many partners to build this evidence base for policymakers, using evidence to create consensus around solutions. And for this group, I should say, you have a really pretty remarkable group of speakers assembled. This is kind of like the higher education brain trust here, so it's really very lucky to have them. We have some of the authors of the memos in the audience. We have Robert Kelton, Stephanie apologies in advance, Salini, Harry Holzer, and Urban's own Matt Chingos. We also have the 4 project leaders for the project today, Ted Mitchell, who is now the president of ACE, American Council on Education, Doug Harris, professor of economics, and Schluter Foundation chair in public education at Tulane, Andrew Kelly, Senior Vice President for Strategy and Policy at UNC, and Urban's own Sandy Baum, who was the project leader for us, memo author, and is a fellow in our education policy program, who'll be moderating the panel as well. We're also joined by Amy Jones and James Quall. Amy is the Director of Education and Human Services Policy for the House Committee on Education and Workforce. James is the former Deputy Director, White House Domestic Policy Council in the Obama administration. And we're especially grateful to have President Margaret Spellings, who's now the president of the University of North Carolina System, and also former Secretary of Education and Domestic Policy Advisor with us also. I'm going to introduce her slightly longer shortly to you, but first I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Doug Harris. In addition to his work at Tulane and his leadership of this project, Doug is a senior fellow at Brookings and has used his research on the measurement of college performance, community college policies, and the cost-effectiveness of college access programs to advise governors, members of Congress, White House staff on all of these policies. So I'm going to turn it over to Doug, and then we'll come back and hear from Margaret before the panel begins. Please join me in welcoming these amazing guests. Thanks very much. See you.
Thanks, Sarah, for the thoughtful comments and for hosting this project at the Urban Institute. So I'm just going to very briefly describe what the project was about, and this is kind of the culmination of that project. So the original idea came about 2 years ago when we realized 3 things. So one was we were going to have a new president. We didn't know who it was going to be. Second was that the Obama administration had significantly changed and increased the federal role in higher education. And the third was that there was a lot of disagreement about that and about what the federal role should be going forward. So it seemed useful going into a new administration to say, all right, what do we all agree on here, and what would be a stable framework going forward to think about what that federal role should be. Then we had an election. And since then, the disagreements that we initially had that motivated the project have only become more stark and divisive. So a recent poll from Pew finds that 66% of Democrats view college professors favorably compared to just 30% of Republicans. And that's a split that actually just emerged in that poll over the last couple of years. A Gallup poll showed that Republican satisfaction with U.S. education dropped from 48% to 32% between 2014 and 2016, even as Democratic support was increasing. So we can debate the reasons for that divide, but I don't think we can debate that it's there, that it's new, and that it's dangerous for the future of higher education. There have always been disagreements about specific issues in higher education, but to have that much disagreement about the basic value of higher education is new and something we really all need to worry about. And of course, we shouldn't fear disagreement about even the value of higher ed, but we also have to worry that if we're actually losing sight of all the things we do agree on in the process. So after the election, people started to ask, well, are we still doing this project? Right? Things have gotten so divisive. And I think my immediate reaction was, well, I think it's actually more important than it was before, because the original motivation was there's a lot of disagreement. Well, there's even more disagreement and divisiveness now, and this kind of project is rare. So what did we do? We started with a K-12 version of the project over at Brookings, and you can see those memos over on their website. Fortunately, we had Sandy Baum agree to lead the project here at the Urban Institute on the higher ed side, and even equally fortunately, having Ted and Andrew co-lead the project here was fantastic. Sarah's already introduced them, so I'm not going to go into a long list of reasons why they were fabulous to work with, although that is true. But I just want to thank them for their efforts in the project from the beginning. And I also want to thank all the memo writers. So some of them are here, some of them are not. Please look at the website to see all of them. They also put a lot of work into thinking about this in the case of very specific issues that they were looking at. So what we did, the four of us, though, was to try to come up with basic principles on what we agree on, not specific issues, but looking at broader values for higher education. And so we came up with four principles, and I'm just going to read them off. Principle 1, the federal government should subsidize higher education, especially for students whose financial circumstances limit their opportunities for enrollment and success. So that principle is important because it reinforces what remains the largest funding-related role of the federal government, which is providing support to low-income students to attend. Principle 2, the federal government should collect and disseminate information that can improve market functioning. So this principle is noteworthy because it highlights that students have choice amongst institutions and that government can play a useful role providing information to make better choices. Principle 3, the federal government must have basic eligibility standards for students and institutions that ensure consumer and taxpayer protection. Accountability policies must weed out poorly performing institutions and support innovations that address equity and efficiency. So the third principle highlights that the government has a fiduciary responsibility to make sure the funding is used well, and also that markets on their own may fail to produce good options for students. And finally, principle 4, the federal government should support research conducted on college and university campuses. This one is certainly near and dear for me. Research and development is a public good that everyone benefits from. In fact, we look at the R&D that is so important to the economy. A lot of it is rooted either directly or indirectly in research universities. So that is also an essential function. So across those four principles, a couple of observations. It's important to emphasize that the government might not be able to solve all problems. So none of us believe that the government can step in and solve all the problems, nor that even when the government can step in, that the federal government necessarily is the right actor to jump into this. So we distinguish between the federal role and the state role, and also then between the government and all the other actors that are responsible for producing effective institutions in education, including parents, students, and the colleges themselves. So we offer these memos to Congress, the President, Secretary DeVos, the public at large to inform and spark debate, to break through the partisan divide, and to help turn these sound principles, at least in some small way, into effective policy. So we're very fortunate to have in this room, as Sarah said, many of the leaders who made these decisions over the last 15 years, and to have them all assembled in one room is remarkable. And I think even if the memos help in some small way to contribute to the debate, I think the discussion that follows here is actually going to be the most important contribution. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah, and she can move this forward. Thank you.
So I'm going to introduce the person who probably in this room needs the least possible introduction, but it is, I think, an appropriate courtesy and respect for really a remarkable career. Margaret Spellings today leads the North Carolina's 17-campus university system, the University of North Carolina, and is dedicated to using that system to help improve the economic and social mobility in that important state. And I should say it is a system where it has had many great leaders in its time. One who's near and dear, close to us, one of our board members, Erskine Bowles, had that job in the past. So it's a place we look to for important policy insight as well as great educational outcomes. As I think you all know, previously she was first the leader of in the Bush administration of the Domestic Policy Council, and then became the U.S. Secretary of Education. At Education, she led the Commission on the Future of Higher Education and spearheaded stronger accountability for schools in the nation, across the whole nation, in the No Child Left Behind policy. She's also a tremendous bridge builder and a person who has really helped to lead education policy, post-secondary education policy thought in particular for the last 20 years. Please join me in welcoming Margaret Spellings.
I told Sarah, thank you for making that blessedly brief. It's just excruciating to, twist and turn while your high school credentials are discussed. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. Thank you all. To travel together with you beyond the partisan divide. And it's a tougher journey than it used to be, God knows, but still a trip worth taking. So Sarah, thank you for your leadership. Thank you, Sandy Baum, for all you have done, are doing, and will do to advance this discussion. It's great to see my friend Ted Mitchell, who just can't get enough and has gone off to lead the American Council on Education. And I want to thank my colleague, Andrew Kelly, who recently left the so-called swamp to join me at the University of North Carolina system. But I really appreciate the title of this discussion because a principled approach to federal higher education policy is what this talk is billed at today. But I wonder if it would have been better to call it a sensible approach to federal education policy, because that's what we're talking about. Really not matters of particularly high principle, but common sense, practical, well-researched solutions that we can all support. And thank you for doing that. We should be proud of that. In an era of Twitter screeds and ideological manifestos, it's downright inspiring to talk about joint policy briefs and consensus reforms. My friends, moderation is the new radicalism. So embrace your status as subversives, as I do. A few weeks ago, I was invited to give a talk reflecting on the anniversary of the so-called Spellings Commission, called the Commission on the Future of Higher Education, which was issued a little more than a decade ago. And I'm struck that so many of the issues we identified then really remain our challenges today. The commission itself was an effort to move beyond the partisan divide, to sketch out a set of shared priorities for our nation's fragmented system of higher education. We brought together experts and policymakers from all parts of the ideological spectrum, including top university leaders from around the country. And as it happened, and like now, there was a lot of consensus around the most substantive issues facing our colleges and universities: affordability, accountability, and the need for more innovation in the classroom and in the business model were core themes of the Commission's report. And those concerns that animate our conversation today and the Urban Institute's excellent series of policy memos. It is not very often in life that you find yourself looking back over a decade grateful to be talking about those same things. But I've got to say that discussing sensible, workable ideas that the federal government can help promote really feels like a relief. There are days when it seems like the entire college and university sector has become just another political and cultural background, a venue for partisans to sharpen their differences and hone their most biting rhetoric. And we were all troubled by the results of the recent Pew poll. Goodness knows I have had more than a few days like that as the head of the University of North Carolina, a public institution often caught in the middle of purple state politics. I spent much of my first year in office meeting with lawyers about who could use which bathroom, which was not, as you can imagine, what I came to the old North State to do. I'm also becoming an expert on Civil War sculpture, in case anyone wants to invite me back for an art history talk anytime soon. But amid all of that heat and noise, there are two things that help us remember the core values of higher education and what we are meant to serve. One is spending time with students because they are just as idealistic, ambitious, hardworking, and smart as ever. And the other is being in a room like this one, where people of good faith and goodwill come together to strengthen these critically important institutions. These discussions were more fun when I was the Secretary of Education and could make a laundry list of recommendations for college presidents to tackle. The title of the Spellings Commission report was actually a test of leadership, and goodness, did we get that right. Certainly for me, I've joked with my friends that my current role is payback for having led the commission. It's one thing to make a bunch of pronouncements from Washington and quite another to try to figure out how to implement those. And I think as we talk today about these policy proposals, we should think about that end user. What I appreciate most about this project's approach to these big issues is the sense of practical idealism, the belief that we can and must do better, with the recognition that even the best ideas will run into the complex realities of big institutions and competing interests. That's why I believe so strongly that the conversation about higher education has to begin with accountability and transparency. The federal government has a profoundly important obligation to drive institutional accountability, promote data-driven decision-making, and use the federal investment in students to drive better outcomes for them and for taxpayers. In shining a national spotlight on the issues of affordability, learning quality, and long-range student success, federal policy can help set the agenda for balanced, thoughtful improvement of our country's higher education system. That has become an even more critical role as federal dollars in higher education continue to grow, both in raw numbers and as a percentage of overall investment. As the briefing paper from Sandy, Doug, Andrew, and Ted makes clear, federal investment in higher education has grown significantly since the recession. A relative decline in state support has made those national dollars even more crucial for students and institutions. Given all of that, I think it's appropriate, I think it's our obligation, in fact, to see that those resources are going where they can do the most good, and I'm proud that the Spellings Commission helped light a fire under the issue a decade ago and still a burning question today. Right now, there seem to be two competing narratives in American higher education. Either it's hopelessly broken and in need of dramatic disruption, or it's extraordinary in every way and should be shielded and preserved as is. I don't think anybody in this room believes in either one of those, and thoughtful policymakers on all sides recognize the legitimate pieces of each narrative while rejecting the dogma of both. Higher education is without doubt one of our nation's greatest success stories, but it needs continuous improvement to stay that way. Colleges and universities are being asked to do more than we've ever done before, serve more students than we've ever served before, and do it in an era of constrained resources and intense public scrutiny. That's great news. It means people recognize the value of higher education and want to see it extended to more Americans. But it also means that the same old ways of doing business are not adequate. The country's unique and decentralized approach to higher learning produces great benefits in terms of specialization and breadth, but also creates confusion and barriers to success. We have one of the most democratic and diversified higher education sectors in the world, but it is marred by huge achievement gaps in race, income, and geography. Recognizing these truths is an act of care, in my view, and focusing on these core concerns is how we build consensus, how we strengthen higher education to broaden opportunity for all Americans, and taking the time to build that consensus, to gather the data, the high-quality research that will lead us to lasting change. Say what you will about No Child Left Behind, but it was a truly bipartisan framework for approaching K-12 education reform, and it has had a long-lasting impact on how we think about achievement gaps in America. It took patient work and a lot of compromise to get that legislation passed, but when it reached President Bush's desk, it arrived there with 384 yay votes in the House and a 98-1 vote in the Senate, margins unheard of for big public policy decisions today. Too much policy over the past few years has been made by executive order and regulatory guidance on both sides of the aisle. Sometimes those can be appropriate tools for tweaking policy or addressing urgent needs, but they're poorly suited to tackling major challenges or enacting deep reforms because they are too often temporary, as we all know. As frustrating as the legislative or regulatory processes can be, and I say this as someone who reports to a 28-member board appointed by a legislature, the painstaking effort to build a coalition is the only way to ensure lasting impact. The good news for higher education is that there's plenty of room for such coalitions, And you see it reflected in this gathering, this standing room only gathering, Sarah, today. I think all of us from different administrations and different points of view agree that there is still too little known about whether our institutions of higher learning are succeeding at their core mission. We don't know whether we are effectively teaching critical reasoning, fundamental mastery of science and mathematics, or advanced reading, writing, or communication skills. We still have a system that largely measures success by the resources committed instead of results achieved. Put simply, we still don't know how well most of our students are doing. Pointing this out doesn't mean questioning the fundamental worth of education, far from it. I'm a firm believer, along with everybody in this room, I suspect, in the capacity of higher education to transform individual lives and lift up our country and our economy. That's why I've devoted much of my life to that work, as many of you have. But as a lifelong public policy maker, I can tell you in no uncertain terms, our aversion to meaningful, reasonable accountability in student outcomes has hurt us. And it hurts students and families who are trying to navigate a maddeningly complex set of options. Our collective reluctance to define measurable learning, to come up with a transparent way of owning our successes and shortcomings, has undermined public confidence and emboldened a less effective, more ideological attitude of disruption, and I think we're seeing that in the numbers. There's no such thing as flawless measurement, of course, but we're not weighing the idea of flawed measurement against a perfect system. We're weighing it against the current reality in which our national conversation about higher education is now driven by a bogus reputational ranking published by a defunct news magazine. Everyone in higher education laments this state of affairs, and yet every time there's a meaningful effort to push for alternative measures of institutional quality, we meet roadblocks. But still, we are making some progress. We can now easily compare costs, graduation rates, and earnings between institutions. You can see a national ranking of how well colleges are serving low-income students. And thanks to path-breaking work by people like Raj Chetty and his colleagues at the Equality of Opportunity Project, we're beginning to see which institutions do the tough and vital work of creating real economic mobility, fulfilling the fundamental promise that higher education makes to students and families. And we're starting to give our own institutions the same rigorous study we've long devoted to other disciplines. Changes in technology, things like online coursework, flipped classrooms, and advanced data analytics. Those tools are allowing us to discover ways to better serve students. These are welcome shifts in the conversation. For decades, far too much of our national attention has been dominated by far too few of our institutions. I personally think it's interesting to discuss Ivy League admission policies. I find it fascinating to explore campus controversies at Yale or parse the faculty politics at Harvard, and you see those in the stories all the time, especially the old gray lady. But when it comes to making a real difference on access and outcomes, the story has to take place in our public campuses that serve the vast majority of America's students. Nearly 70% of our students are enrolled at 2-year and 4-year public institutions, and they are often given short shrift in our national discussion about higher education, and that must change. The community colleges, the fast-growing regional institutions, the HBCUs, the rural campuses, these places do the heavy lifting when it comes to broadening opportunity. The fate of the American economy and American civic life hinges less on Princeton's dining halls than on the commuter lots and advising offices at public colleges. The eye-popping tuition at private schools gets a lot of notice, but the steady rise in costs at our public institutions is more worrisome. Containing college costs and streamlining financial aid must be at the front of our national agenda. For most families in the United States, the single most important fact about higher education is it's not affordable. Even at public institutions, most families can't pay out of pocket for a year of higher education. Most families don't have anywhere near the savings to support a child through 2 or 4 or often 5 or 6 years of study. We have sold college as the golden ticket to middle class opportunity, then priced average families out of that market. With a more competitive world demanding higher levels of education, we're at risk of letting inequities in access harden into unbridgeable economic divide. Too many families look at the cost of college and see a closed door, not just to education, but to the promise of middle-class stability that is still the core of the American dream. Is it any wonder that the growing divide in perceptions of higher education exist? Growing questions about whether the colleges and universities in our country are fulfilling their role as the engine of upward mobility, and growing resentment from those who feel shut out. Americans still believe strongly in the value of education. What they're questioning, and reasonably so, is whether higher education values all students. You see that worry reflected in all of the recent proposals for free college, whether it's free community college in Tennessee, free tuition at SUNY institutions, or free college for everybody as a thundering applause line in Bernie Sanders' speeches. It's appealing, I get it, but it ignores the hard questions about where to aim our resources to do the most good for those in need. Instead of looking for politically appealing solutions, we must look for the most meaningful impact. Instead of doing away with tuition, which will subsidize millions of well-resourced families, we could target financial aid more effectively. We must develop funding formulas that reward institutions that leave students better off and shift investment from those that don't. Those are the concerns that ought to keep our policymakers up at night. Those are the things we need to be spending time and energy solving, instead of turning one of our country's greatest assets into a marker of political, cultural, and economic division. I've increasingly come to believe that the true test of leadership in higher education is to avoid the tyranny of the urgent, and believe me, this is hard, resisting the endless stream of high-profile distractions that take us away. That's especially true now, when higher education has become the preferred venue for some of the sharpest partisans and some of the most strident culture warriors in the public square. We've always been an arena for debate and controversy, but now we are a regular actor in political dramas we didn't seek and usually don't control. And that takes a toll, both in terms of public perception and in our day-to-day ability to get things done. Thoughtful people from across the political spectrum can still come together and come to agreement about how we can improve our institutions of higher learning and are part of our conversation today. What we need are civic leaders interested in serving those institutions, not using them, critical partners in every sense. That means state and federal policymakers who choose to invest in the long-range prosperity that flows from a better educated citizenry. It means business leaders willing to roll up their sleeves and get involved in the civic institutions that underpin our economic strength. The source of our strength has always been a vision of education that includes everyone, that reflects the country it serves. Making that a reality is our most urgent task, today's test of leadership. Thank you. I feel happier on the right.
Thank you. Okay. do I have this
Depends
right?
where you're
Can you hear
sitting.
me?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your comments. That was amazing and so totally well suited to what we're trying to accomplish, which is a conversation that is radical in its moderation and that brings together people with very different viewpoints so that we can really move forward in a constructive way. So we're going to have a bit of a conversation, give Ted a chance to make some comments, and then bring the audience into the discussion to ask questions. So it's very interesting. I think that moderation comment is very meaningful in this environment. And Ted, President Spellings said that she sees the conversation being in the extremes of, in higher education, people either are sort of saying, we need radical disruption, the whole system has to change and it will change, or on the more defending the status quo side, we're doing a great job, we have the best higher education system in the world, so stop with all of this criticism. In that environment, is that the way you see it, and how do we move this conversation forward?
So first of all, Margaret, that was spectacular, and just a real honor to be up here with you.
Give it to you, you can give it also.
Perfect, perfect. And I want to come back to a couple of the specific things that you said toward the end in a moment or two, but education has always been like this, whether it's K-12 or higher education. We fall into this trap of being driven to our corners. One corner this way, one corner that way, where in fact, I hate sports analogies, but I'll use one. The most effective work is oftentimes between the 40-yard lines. So that you could go all the way to the 10-yard line and you lose a bunch of people. You go the other way to the 10-yard line, you lose a lot of people. But there's plenty of stuff to get done between the 40-yard lines. And I think we just have to, if we're really going to get beyond the partisan divide, we have to develop that kind of mindset. And I think that's what you invited us to do today. I think that's what the authors of the paper invited us to do, and what we tried to get at in the framing paper. And when you get into the 40-yard lines, the first thing you do is you find common principles and common values. And I think that's what really joined this project, is that if you start with just a couple of basic things, higher education is an engine of social mobility. It ought to be, and it ought to stay that way. Therefore, a principled approach to policymaking ought to take the use of federal resources to distribute access. It ought to take that seriously. Second, we decided centuries ago that higher education would be provided in a mixed market. There would be an enormous diversity of institutional forms and missions. That's a great thing and one of our real strengths. But that mixed market needs some help to be able to function well. And so data, transparent access to that data, helping students and families make good choices is critical to following up on the basic access point. The third principle that we think is necessary in that mixed market is having thresholds. And this is where I think we were really listening to the echoes of the Spellings Commission when we were thinking about accountability and need to continue to do so. What should be the basic requirements for institutions? What should be the basic requirements for individuals? And finally, this centrally important role that American higher education has come to play in the development of science and technology, art, music, culture, the research that's done every day in our major research universities, in our comprehensive public institutions, and in a welter of independent institutions as well. If you can start there with a set of very basic principles, you can begin to enlist people into the debate about specific policy ideas that might be consistent with those principles and advance them. But I think unless you're willing to just develop a little bit of a sense of middle, you can quite easily get caught running to one very partisan side or another. So sorry, that's a longer answer than you wanted.
No. But so that makes a lot of sense, but in a way it's easier said than done, and it's easier to articulate these principles than it is to actually apply them to specific issues. So you said, for example, that accountability is the starting point, and you talked about accountability too. And I think everybody agrees that the system should be accountable, higher education institutions should be accountable, but when you start trying to get specific about it, no one wants to be the target of those accountability rules, and there's a lot of pushback. I'm sure you're going to experience this in your new role. So how do you deal with that? How do you say, yes, despite your political power, despite who you represent, you do need to be held accountable, and we have to figure that out? How do you balance that?
Having broken my pick on pushing for a unit record system at the federal level, which I still believe is a good idea.
I do
bet
too.
you do too, Ted. But I'm convinced, and it was an important part of my decision to come to North Carolina, that the venue for that, to make some real progress, is at the state level. And one of the reasons that I wanted to recruit Andrew Kelly to come help me think through, how do we construct a protocol that are the right types of measurements and the right ways to do it that are, major in the majors, as I like to tell my Board of Governors, who sometimes major in the minors, around, access and achievement and student success and research. And so we developed quickly, in less than a year, a strategic plan that had these big themes. And then, to Andrew's great credit, we negotiated 16 performance agreements with each of our institutions that are very specific about rural achievement, low-income achievement, and so on. And so I think we have to get granular. We have to do it at the state level. And I will also say, and I'm sure this holds true for other states, we have woefully underinvested in data infrastructure in our universities. We're running 17 institutions with no common chart of accounts. I mean, we hardly know anything about the enterprise to start with. And so when people start asking, well, how much does it cost to educate a teacher versus an engineer, we really can't tell you. And so, it's just really shocking. And so we need to, in North Carolina's case, it's a $10 billion enterprise with almost nothing in the way of management information. And Ted, I know that was, the Department of Education made some great progress, and we're running a big student loan database with a lot of protected information, so it's better than a lot of other places, but still fundamental to how we do this work in ways that are trusted and fair and rapid.
And I think that the trusted and fair is a really important element in these kinds of institutions, diverse as they are, because too often data can be misused. And I think building that trust at the institutional level with students, with faculty, with families is critical. I endorse the idea of the states carrying the water in this for a while yet. Hopefully that will change. But one of the papers by Jordan Matsudaira talks about states, talks about state partnerships, talks about federal investments in state data systems as a kind of two-step to get to the issue of fair and transparent data. And it's sort of one form of accountability. There are many that run the gamut from totally prescriptive to information-based accountability.
Right. Exactly.
And I'm a fan of information-based accountability because one size fits all just doesn't comport with the diversity of American higher education. But information about an institution on its terms that essentially asks the question, how well are you fulfilling your mission?
Right, exactly.
Is just, I think, a root question that has to be at the base of a kind of public accountability.
But I want to add one other quick thing, because we have institutions that are guilty of this also, and that is that to the extent that you define the mission, this is exactly what the commission said, you define your mission and tell us how well you're doing at it, but let's go the next step and make that publicly available. So for institutions that use the CLA, for example, which is kind of a crazy quilt system of indicators, and then it's not very useful to the end user, to the consumer who's trying to figure out, what do I know about this place or that. So I think we need to be better with respect to having it be a tool for students.
Let me push you both a little bit on this question of whether information is, as important as information is and as important as data are, whether this is sufficient in terms of really getting to an effective system of accountability. As the Ben Castleman's memo in our series highlights, looking at how people actually make decisions, it's really clear that just giving them the information and expecting them to make rational decisions that are going to maximize their well-being, especially in a context like that of higher education, it may be unrealistic, right? So we can tell people that there are institutions that won't serve them well, but they're going to think, oh, it will be great for me. I will succeed at that institution. And it's obviously very complicated, right? All these institutions have different kinds of student bodies, et cetera, so one size fits all doesn't make sense. But we put a lot of information out there, right? And still, as you said, the mixed market, it doesn't necessarily work so well. The federal government's spending a lot of money on federal student aid for many students who are not actually gaining much from it. What do we do about that?
I think we need to start earlier. And this too is, I think, better done by states than by the federal government. So that there's an expectation, and we see this in charter schools like KIPP, where there's an ethic of college going and an understanding of your own pathway to and through higher education. And I think there's lots of work to be done there. And we're launching something in North Carolina to look at our state need and merit-based aid programs, which again is a crazy quilt of programs coupled with a crazy quilt of federal programs. And as I used to say in my secretarial days, it's as if we're trying to keep students out, not get them in. And so we've got to redesign that stuff to make it more coherent. And frankly, I think the for-profits have done this much better than we in the public sector.
So I think the Nobel Committee would endorse your view that people don't always make decisions
Yes.
based on perfect information or even their own best interest. So it's an uphill climb. I think that in addition to the work that states are doing, that there are opportunities that the federal government has that the federal government is not taking advantage of. So populating back to a FAFSA applicant some of these outcome data on institutions that they might be interested in. It gets the information to somebody without them having to take the one step of asking about it. Does that guarantee that I'm going to make the best college choice? No. My daughter just went through this process last year. I'm deeply aware of how different kinds of information are processed.
Please don't say she's at the University of North Carolina system.
I would have told you before that. So I think that there is more that we can do. I also think that you're exactly right that creating a college-going culture and atmosphere earlier is an important part of this. And helping, Ben's paper is a great example, helping people by nudging them to be focusing on the right question at the right time with the right information and response. It's not easy, but I think we can do more.
So the conversation about innovation in higher education, I think, fits into this model that you framed of the extremes, where there are people who think that we need to really have radical transformation. We need to innovate. We need new methods of delivery. We need new structures. We need new ways of defining progress in higher education. And then on the other hand, there are people who are worried. No one says, well, some people may say we don't want anything to change, but people are very worried about how we can maintain accountability while we have innovation. How do we make sure that some new idea that people think is just going to be the be-all and end-all doesn't take hold and we put a lot of money into it or give people a lot of financial aid to go off to these untried institutions? How do we balance innovation and progress with making sure that we maintain quality and accountability?
Outcomes, outcomes, outcomes. I think that if, and this is something that we've agreed on for a long time, if you make sure that you're clear and crisp about what the outcomes are that are desired, then you can allow the inputs and the processes to vary a great deal. And I think one of the things that when I came into government, I kind of knew this from the ground level when I was a college president, but there's a tremendous amount of innovation going on in the sector now. And it's not like institutions aren't trying to figure out new ways of doing things, new business models, new uses of instructional technology. I think where we're missing the mark is in not evaluating those as natural experiments and then really trying to build the field with a library of practice about which of these things work and don't work. But I don't want to trivialize the concern. if you're going to experiment, the risk tolerance has to be such that you accept failure and you accept things that don't work. And I think that this is where, in our framing paper, we tried to suggest that there should be guardrails around institutions so that the range of that failure would be limited. And I think that there's not a formula for it, but there is a way in which we should support responsible innovation, evaluate innovations, collect information about what's working, especially for the new normal college student, right? It's the 70% of people who are in public institutions. But even more sharply focused, they're the 22-year-old returning veteran, the 30-year-old single mom, the 50-year-old displaced textile worker who needs to be reskilled. That really requires a different approach to delivering what we have than we currently demonstrate.
And, I think the environment we're doing it, to the extent that we have this political tension in American higher education, frankly, the people I work for are, demanding innovation and enthusiastic about it. And frankly, we are a very well-funded public higher education system with, frankly, a, fairly low-risk environment. A president and a governing board that says go to it, lots of money that's sloshing around. And, I don't know, Andrew, if you would agree with that, but course redesign and things like this are so obvious and so basic that, let's go to it. And so I don't want to minimize the risk, but frankly, it's not that scary to try some new things in a public setting where there's almost no risk for the innovator with respect to their own livelihood or anything else.
Sandy, can I do one more paragraph? I think that this is an interesting place for us to talk about the partisan divide, because in my experience with Congress, there's nobody in Congress who really disagrees that we ought to be supporting innovation, becoming more efficient, and hopefully more equitable at the same time. And so it's a good place to start to look and to kind of draw a magnet over, as we think about the Higher Ed Act, draw a magnet over that 1,000 pages and see where innovation is supported, see where innovation may be stifled, and begin to have a conversation about how to set up the right width between the guardrails.
And this is what's so, frustrating about, a lack of data infrastructure that will let you know those things. And I know it sounds so boring, but we're so underinvested that it's hard to really understand when innovation works and when it doesn't.
I'm going to ask one more question and then bring the audience in. You've both said that there are things that we should leave to the states because the states will be more effective in the accountability area in particular. And yet we're talking about the potential reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. We all agreed in this project that there is a significant role for the federal government in higher education. And of course, the federal government is spending a lot of money and providing an increasing share of the resources. And if you look at states, there's North Carolina, but there are a lot of states with a lot of different policies and practices that have very different outcomes in terms of access to higher education, in terms of tuition prices, state funding, et cetera. So if the federal government's job is in any way to be worrying about affordability and access and educational attainment, how do we balance that? And yet it's a state-run, basically, system of public higher education. How do we navigate that? What should the federal government be doing in order to respect the state's role and encourage the state's role?
Well, I'll start and just say that I think states, as a practical matter, are where this debate is happening, not because I think it's better, because I think we're going to design, X number of cul-de-sacs and not know much about what we really have. So in my perfect world, we would have some discrete but fairly powerful federal level levers that would be rooted in a unit record system, et cetera. So, that's plan A, but we're not on plan A, we're on plan B. So, which is the role of the states. And I think, again, better data systems that will allow us to do that, and also, agreeing on what it is that we want to accomplish. And so that's, kind of the first principles of coherent strategic plans or plans with goals that are measurable and short-term enough that you can show some progress. And it's just kind of meat and potatoes management stuff. That's what we're trying to work on.
So I agree wholeheartedly with Margaret on the data system issue, and I think we got to deal with what we've got now, and hopefully push towards something that's much bigger and bolder, because students have this annoying habit of not staying within state lines and moving around and taking jobs other places and stuff like that. But I want to take it a slightly different direction. I think if we look at the growth of the federal role, increasing federal share in funding higher education, the flip side of that story is the abdication by states of their responsibility to fund public education broadly, but public higher education. And every state feels this, some more acutely than others. But it's that abandonment of the state responsibility that has put the burden of tuition costs more squarely on the shoulders of families at just the time in the Great Recession and after, when they can least afford it. And that's the growth of student debt. I think we need to be in the business at all levels of reminding states of their responsibility in funding higher education. And what's missing in that is the idea, and you've said it so well this morning, Margaret, of higher education not just as an individual good, an individual investment, but as a social good. Higher education is one of the well springs of American democracy. It is one of the engines of our economy. It is the source of a lot of great development in civic culture across the country. And that part of the debate has been missing. And I think that it's up to all of us to take that message forward.
I just want to add one quick thing, coming from a state with very high levels of state support for the system, and I'm certainly not arguing against that, but I do think that those high levels of support have mitigated against our need to innovate and be facile and responsive. And so, when you see states, necessity is the mother of invention and all of that. So I think there's a little bit of a dark side there on funding adequacy. We need to try both.
Fair enough.
Questions? Other people want to get engaged in the conversation. Harry.
So thank you very much for this. I'm Harry Holzer from Georgetown. Thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. My question is for both Ted and Secretary Spellings. I just had the good fortune of writing a book with Sandy. And at the end of that process, after a couple of years, we came to this conclusion, which we didn't necessarily start with, that some very tough choices need to be made here, and there's a level of realism that we don't see right now in the higher ed system, and especially at some of the two-year public institutions. We're sending huge numbers of students there who, frankly, are not very well prepared. The vast majority of people who go there seem to think that not only are they going to get a two-year degree, but actually they're going to transfer, get a four-year degree. Almost very, very few of those students actually do. And yet we're very reluctant to tell anybody. We have these workforce programs that maybe might be a better fit. We're fearful of tracking, and appropriately so given the history, but the fear of tracking seems to have moved from career and tech ed up to the higher ed system. I just want to hear how both of you think about how you wrestle with those hard choices while we need to maximize opportunity and access, how at the same time we balance it with this realism in a world of scarce resources and scarce times. Maybe liberal arts in associate degrees is not the best fit for people. Maybe that won't be rewarded in the marketplace, but how do you wrestle with those tough choices without falling into the tracking swamp that we want to avoid?
You go first. That's a hard one.
Time's up.
Yeah.
Thanks, Harry. No denying that the circumstances on the ground are tough, and that we all need to do better. I have great enthusiasm for the dynamism of the community college sector, both on the career and technical side and on the transfer pathways. It's not universal, but there's an awful lot that we're learning in terms of this sort of innovations that we're beginning to evaluate that we can then scale. So guided pathways to degrees and transfer opportunities that have, overusing guardrails, but some very, very narrow pathways for students so that the decision making from quarter to quarter, semester to semester is less random than it might otherwise be. That seems to hold great promise. The stuff that you guys have written about, real industry partnerships. Community colleges have their thumb on the pulse of the local labor market like nobody else. And the ability of community colleges to create partnerships with local businesses to craft customized training programs is pretty extraordinary. What we need to do, talking about innovation, to unlock some of that, and you guys have written about this, is to examine ways to make it more affordable for students to develop, to move along those pathways, maybe not in a 2-year chunk, maybe in smaller chunks, accumulating certificates along the way that could be stacked and added together to something bigger, including a transfer degree. I will say, though, in the spirit of absolute honesty, one of the things we have to work on as a sector is the friction and frustration caused by the transfer credit market. And so it's one of the things that we're talking about across our membership at ACE, and something that I think we need to really double down on.
Amen. I was smiling at Andrew because I've talked relentlessly and endlessly about that. I want to add a couple thoughts to your good answer. One is that, and this sounds maybe too goo-goo-headed, but we need some marketing around expectations, what it is that the marketplace is requiring and demands. That is about the world, and we need leadership around that. We in North Carolina, our rural achievement gap is just shocking and very troubling. And because if Johnny leaves, it kills the town. And so what does it mean for the community and all that sort of stuff? So we need to do some marketing. The other thing, and I was doing a lobbying with Sandy earlier, I think governance in American higher education is a very relevant issue that is untapped for its potential. We are not organized to be successful, and to have these sort of themes get worked out because we're so siloed, and a million other things beyond being siloed, but very decentralized governance that systems where the goals aren't the same. I mean, it's a mess. So I want Sandy to do some work on that.
Thank you. Okay. Who's going to ask the next question?
Diane, is that you?
So one of the things that I think in higher ed we've talked about for decades is that we know that there are all these confounding variables that, income inputs affect outcomes and outputs. And yet we've been willing to just ignore them and say, oh, no, the outcomes are they have a causal relationship with quality. But we know that there are lots and lots of things about student demographics, institutional profiles, rural, urban, that have a huge impact on outcomes. We've actually developed a methodology that we can use the power of statistics to try to suppress some of those confounding variables and really look at value added based on what the student brings. But we find that among elite institutions don't want to have a conversation about value added,
right,
because it's very hard to show value added when you already start with perfect people.
Right.
So so I'm wondering, do you have any advice for us? Do you have thoughts about institutions that we can get to join this experiment with us? Because we really find some interesting results when you're able to disaggregate by risk groups, when you're able to actually start suppressing confounding variables. Any advice for how we can move this forward and not be shot down by elite institutions that are perfectly happy to keep living life the way they've been living it?
Can I just augment that question to say, as part of that I'm also concerned about how do we make sure that these models that show us that we actually have relatively low expectations for institutions that enroll students from poorly prepared backgrounds, that we don't settle for low outcomes for them because of their characteristics. So that's both ends of the spectrum.
Okay, as I used to say in my secretarial days, in the cone. Mostly they're not part of the problem and they're not part of the solution. So my first advice is move on. Start with the Coalition of the Willing. I don't mean to disparage some of Ted's members, but you know, I mean, as I sometimes tell the chancellor of our flagship, it's, you know, anybody can educate a university of valedictorians. So that's not the biggest work that we have to do right now. And I commend you for this work around kind of netting out some of those variables, and we need to do more of that. In our system, we have some incredible bangs for the buck in Western Carolina and places like that that are beating the odds. And again, back to our marketing, we need to elevate that. What a great value to get to, you know, that much progress for that kind of investment of time and money. And I think we ought to all talk about it.
So I think that there are institutions that would be thrilled to have their hard work in creating mobility, value add, to have that validated and celebrated. So let's talk about that.
So could you send them to us? Because, you know, so for example, you know, we have one institution we're working with. It's a public HBCU, and they've been criticized for years and years of having these awful outcomes. But when we do the, you know, confounding variable studies, when we disaggregate data by risk profile, what we find is that among their low-risk students, they too have a 72% graduation rate. Mm-hmm. It's the, you know, it's the lovely, you know, the Simpsons paradox, right? That their outcomes on each individual group of students are actually better than some institutions that get rave reviews. It's just they have a larger proportion of students that are in the high-risk category than the low-risk category. We also found that this institution has a remarkable success with students who are working full-time. So when we disaggregate data, we really start to pick out these interesting trends, and we find, you know, innovations that are working that you would never see if you're just looking at an institution flat out, this is your graduation rate. Yep. So I guess maybe I'm begging, if you have institutions that you think would be interested, we would love to help them look at their data in a different way, because we do think this value added is an important message. So if you can help us get it out, that'd be great.
Check.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Other issues? Yes.
Hi, Jason Cottrell. I work at the department in the Titles 3, 5, and 7 area for our minority serving institutions and our low income serving institutions. And we're working right now to try to redesign how we're collecting data on those grants, the Title 3, 5, and 7 grants, and moving those from compliance-based to more outcomes-based. And so what we know from those grants is that those institutions are doing really great things, but they're just not getting their stories told. How should we encourage those institutions to actually tell those stories based on the outcomes of their grants? And they are collecting a lot of money, and so the innovation that is there is there, and we don't know that much about them. And so how should we push those institutions to do a better job in telling what they're doing and how they're doing it, and what the results are, what the outcomes are?
Before you answer, can I just remind the online audience that you can submit questions to events@urban.org. Thank you.
So the first and most important thing is to join the American Council on Education. I don't have another answer. So I think I'll take it in. What you're identifying and what you're identifying are I think, endemic problems in American higher education. And it's sort of the flip side of the great diversity of our institutions, is that lots of institutions believe that they're sort of the only one of their kind anywhere. And so it prevents us from sharing, it prevents us from scaling things that work, and it just prevents us from sort of being effective at telling stories. So you know, when we were in the department, we did a report on institutions that were having great success with Pell students. It was a first crack at the kind of analysis that kind of dug down and said, well, what are these institutions doing? I think the more that we collectively, whether it's Urban, whether it's the department, whether it's ACE, the more we can do that kind of storytelling on behalf of the institutions that are doing brave things every day to serve their students and the country, the better off we're going to be. And I think we just have to think about what tools do we have that we're not using? I include ACE in that.
And just to add to that, I think the more that validation can come from third parties that are not vested. I mean, we love
That's right.
ACE and proud members and all of that, but let's get the business community, let's get the civil rights community, let's get the faith-based community, those folks.
The
helping
unusual
Yeah.
suspects. Yep.
Keenan Thompson from Access X Institute. You started talking about how we can. Thanks. You started talking about how we can start finding middle ground in this 40-yard line, and then the more that I've listened to this conversation I'm wondering if that's so much true, because you talk about institutions who have their own vested interests. I mean, we've now kind of alluded to the fact that there is some institutions who want things to stay the same and some who don't. And so my question is, if you've got all these kind of disparate interests in the institutional level, how do we actually make policy and come to agreement on policy when actually we're, it seems, I'd love to believe that there's lots of in the middle, but what's in the middle that we can all agree on? I guess that's, how do we move this conversation forward into turning into policy when there seems to be so many disparate interests at the institutional level?
Well, I think it's those are the things that are spoken to in these policy papers and some of the things we've talked about. If 70% of our nation's students are in public 4-year and 2-year institutions, I mean, that's the 70% that I'm going to start with. The 30% that won't come along on accountability or whatever, forget about it. Let's just start there in the middle. And so it's better data systems, earlier information, better financial aid targeting. We're struggling right now in North Carolina with just an obsession with low tuition. We have the lowest tuition in the country, and we're mad as hell about it. To the detriment of smarter, better invested financial aid that helps students who need it. So those are the things that I think it's getting down to the bowels of policymaking at the state level in a coherent way between community college and public 4-year institutions that really can have a big impact.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm a Pollyanna about most things, so I do think, including this, I do think that there's a middle. Sure, there will be people who want less and people who want more, but I think that there's a substantial middle ground. And I wrote down a couple, well, Margaret was talking, things that there's already evidence of bipartisan support, not at the principle, I think that they support the principles that we're talking about, but really nitty-gritty stuff. So continued Fafsa simplification, right? That's sort of like the 47-yard line. Loan simplification. Mm-hmm. Every administration has said we have too many loan programs. How many do we have, by the way? Quiz?
Dozens.
7. Who can name all 7? Remarkable support across the spectrum for DACA students. We need to keep working on that. Summer Pell, support for apprenticeships, support for research that fuels our economy, income-driven repayment plans, and some level of data and transparency. Mm-hmm. That's pretty broad ground right there.
So we have time for one more question, and it's going to come from someone online. This is from Dimitri Morgan at Loyola University in Chicago. What specifically should states or the federal government do to address persistent racial inequities? Put more specifically, should accountability and transparency account for racial gaps? And if so, in what ways? Why is it so often overlooked in these discussions?
What gets measured gets done. And I think that's why accountability systems, just like we did with No Child Left Behind, I'm loath to make an analogy, but when it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. And so that we just have to put some muscle around that and some consequences, either at the state or federal level. And can I also say that, often, I don't know about in Illinois, but certainly in North Carolina, values like rural identifications are a proxy for first generation, low income, and minority. So no matter how you slice it, we're in the zone.
So it does come back. What you measure does get done, and how you measure it is at the root of that. And I don't want to make this a discussion solely about data, But until we can disaggregate data reliably by race, by gender, by socioeconomic class, by major and program and other things, geography, these are going to be very hard to do. All the more reason for us to put our shoulder to the wheel on better data.
So I want to thank you both very much. I think this has been a great conversation. And I think, though, that we do have to remember that we want to have a conversation that's bipartisan and brings in people who actually have more dramatic things to say about higher education policy. And if we can bring them in around the edges, I think we can make some real progress. Thank you.
That was really fun.
Good morning again from the third event of today's event. I'm Andrew Kelly. Recently departed Washington D.C. about a year ago to join the University of North Carolina system, and believe it or not, I'm glad to be back in Washington for just about 8 hours before I fly back to where the parking is cheap and there's no traffic at RDU. When I first left, some people from the swamp said, oh man, how could you leave DC? It's such a great time to be here and so much excitement around higher ed policy. And anybody who I think heard the speech would recognize why I chose to go to North Carolina. So I'm grateful every day I get to go to work with President Spellings. And I think that speech makes it clear why. I'm happy to be here with some old friends, some longtime friends of mine. Amy Jones is the lead ed staffer on the House Education and Workforce Committee. Amy and I got to know each other very well over my time in Washington, over many a phone call and discussions of meaty higher ed issues. James Quall is the founder of, and I'm going to make sure I get the name right, the College Movement, which we're all excited to hear a lot more about. And prior to that, James was the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor in the White House. We wanted to pair our first panel, which was a discussion more about the principles of the federal role, with a little bit of a drill down into some more specific questions around particular policy issues. And so who better to take that job than these two, representing in some sense two sides of the aisle, but also I think some of that middle ground that we've talked about so much, having gotten to know you all over the years. So I wanted to start with an overarching question. We touched on it a little bit early. Certainly Margaret's speech touched on it a lot. But in July of this year, the Pew Research poll released a study that found that nearly 60% of Republicans now believe that higher education has a negative effect on the country. Then just 2 years ago, that ratio is nearly reversed. So 55% of Republicans saw higher education as a positive force. So this is a question for both of you, and it's really pretty straightforward, and it's how did we get here is the first part. And the second is what are the implications for federal policy and for federal policy making? So have at it.
You want to start? Or?
Sure. So I think a couple of things. We hear all the time, members hear all the time from employers who are saying, we need these employees, we need employees, we need employees. And we hear from all of the colleges, oh, people need jobs, people need jobs. But for some reason, the things aren't, there's not a connection there. So I think that's a challenge, first and foremost. And my boss now loves to say that all higher education is career education because people are looking to go to school to get a job. And so how are colleges preparing students for the workforce? We also hear the other thing we hear from employers a lot is when they do get college graduates, they're underprepared. So they'll need help with writing, they'll need help with analytical thinking, those types of things. So I think hearing those things from employers, I think has caused some concern about the value of higher ed. And that combined with continued increased tuition that members hear about all the time, things that, you know, do you really need a 4-year, the push to get people into a baccalaureate degree program when you're hearing so much about the skills gap and people needing kind of sub-baccalaureate workforce development, I think, is a challenge too. And so the fact that a lot of federal policy pushes towards more 4-year institutions, I think, is a problem. And leading to that combined with also just the free speech issues, frankly, that have been happening all over campus, where you're hearing a lot about in the press that conservative voices are being kind of shuffled off campus, or the protests are such that schools don't want to host those types of speakers. So I think all of those things combined kind of lead us to some of these analyses.
I think I agree with Amy that there are both cultural and economic factors that are mixed up here, and we do have a very polarized time where the views of many of our central institutions, from the news media to the police to unions to churches, increasingly has a partisan divide. So I think that in part universities are not alone, and we should be thinking about the broader, social issues around polarization. In many ways, universities are kind of at the epicenter of, tolerance, multiculturalism, political correctness, internationalism, and so I think that in part kind of makes them a target for the feeling that some people have that our culture is changing too quickly and that traditional values are being eroded. I also think, though, as people who specialize on the higher ed piece of it, it is important to think about whether college is the consistent route to the middle class that we promise people it is. And I think we know that a college degree is worth $1 million, actually $500,000 in present value. Student debt is $30,000. We look at that and say, like, that's a great deal. And it's easy for us, I think, to be a little bit complacent about that and not look at an overall graduation rate of 60%, of 1 million people defaulting on their loans every year. And so, I think that as small d Democrats, we should be listening to the experiences of the public and what they're telling us, and trying to make sure that we're more consistently offering students a reliable path to where they want to go.
So how does it affect policymaking? I mean, as somebody who sits in that chair now.
So I think there's a lot of interest because of all of these factors: tuition, whether students are coming out prepared, whether students are coming out at all, students having a lot of debt, those types of things. I think there's a lot of interest in kind of the disruptors and a lot of the innovation that's happening out there, whether that be things like kind of the stackable credential idea, just courses, some of the programs that are kind of starring up courses, trying to figure out competency-based education, which isn't so much of a disruptor. It's been around for a long time, but we're really digging our hands into that now. And I think that's a lot of where the conversation is going. We've heard a lot on the Hill about short-term programs and trying to figure out ways to get aid to short-term programs. There's a lot of conversation around not everyone needs kind of a 4-year or baccalaureate degree, because a lot of places you can't actually get out in 4 years. So all of that conversation is really rising to the top more so than in previous reauthorizations, I think.
You agree with that, James?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is everything that we're talking about. I think on the cultural side, it's less of an issue for policymakers. I think higher education leaders need to be attentive to the position that they occupy on the landscape and attempt to be inclusive of the communities they serve, including racial diversity and economic diversity, but also the other communities. President Spellings mentioned rural communities that feel marginalized. I think for our policymakers, I think we need to start with the measuring of outcomes that's been discussed. I think we need to think about who is graduating, who is finding a job, who is otherwise reaching their goals, and find ways to help colleges apply the things that we know work to improve those student outcomes. and also to rethink our system of student debt so that it is less risky when students try college and it doesn't work out for them.
That's a great segue. We did not stage that segue, but it's a perfect segue to question number 2. And actually, I was remiss in not thanking my co-editors in particular Sandy for hosting us here today, and Ted and Doug for inviting me to do this project with them. And I will miss our Friday afternoon at 5 p.m. calls, as fun as those were for me. So thank you, and thank you, Sandy, for hosting. I wasn't alone, I think, in seeing the new latest research from NCES. They put out a new study that compared students from the mid-'90s cohort to those from the early 2000s, from the BPS study, I believe it was. And some really shocking numbers on student debt, a steep increase in student loan default, particularly among dropouts, which I think is not necessarily a surprise to people who do this for a living, but the numbers still stood out. And so Sandy and Matt wrote Matt Chingos, who's up here in the front from Urban as well, wrote a great memo on student loan repayment and options therein, and I encourage you to read it. But I did want to kind of zoom out and just ask a basic question that I used to get asked all the time when I was in your seat, which was, is there a student debt crisis? Do we face a student debt crisis? If so, what is it?
I think that there is, but I think we need to be a little bit careful. So student debt is not the macroeconomic threat to the economy that housing was. And so we're not talking about a bubble, we're not talking about a potential recession. And I also think that the very high six-figure debts that sometimes get a lot of immediate attention are very rare. So it is not a crisis in the sense that sometimes people label it as a crisis. But I do think that we need to pay careful attention to the fact that 1 million students a year are defaulting, and that has very serious consequences. Their credit reports, their government benefits get garnished, their wages can get garnished, they cannot go back to school, so they're denied access to opportunity. You see, the other thing that is shocking to me, and there's evidence of it in the NCES report, is just how slowly students repay their loans. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the cohort of students who started in 2003, the overall median loan repayment amount outstanding is 78%. So they owe almost 80 cents for every dollar that they borrowed 12 years ago. And this was, remember, before the big push in online for-profit enrollment that we associate with a lot of the student loan problems. So I think this is something, we really need to understand. The scale of student debt is unlike anything that existed a generation ago. So in a way, we're in uncharted territory. This is a new experiment. I think yes to most of the things that are in Sandy and Matt's paper. I think simplifying income-based repayment, payroll deduction, connecting the formula to the amount you borrow, it makes a lot of sense. I think that, secondly, and I would fault the Obama administration a little bit, I think we need to pay much more careful attention to how these things work in practice. Mm-hmm. And being policy people, we thought first for a policy solution and designed these new repayment plans. We're now at a point where, in theory, no one should be defaulting on their student loans. Everyone should have a loan repayment that they can afford, and if for some reason the formula doesn't work for you, you can get forbearance or deferment. And yet we have 1 million defaults a year. So when Ted was running a shop over there, he set a goal of 0 default. From a policy perspective, there's no reason why we couldn't have 0 student loan defaults, and we need to be paying attention to the way our contracts work, the way our partners at colleges work, to try and drive those defaults way down.
Amy, I know you think about this a lot in your current role. Are there ideas out there that could help borrowers in the near term and pass muster with a majority in Congress, which is the second part, obviously, being the most important?
Right. We'll see. No, I do think there are a number of kind of policy ideas that are out there that I think are going to need to work in concert in order to deal with this. I agree a lot with some of what James was saying in terms of trying to lower the rhetoric on kind of this idea of the student loan bubble and the student loan defaults. And I think Sandy was actually one of the first people we had up during the over 24 hearings that the committee has had on this topic to actually say, like, into the mic, there isn't a student debt crisis in the way that people were talking about it, because you don't have these high level, kind of the high balance borrowers are on the norm. But what you do have, and what we're focused on, are the folks that are kind of graduating with debt with no degree. And so what do we want to do about that? I think on the front end, from a personal perspective, trying to instill better financial literacy up front, trying to give people better information and throughout their post-secondary career about what aid is both available to them and how much they're getting as they're going through it. I think simplifying the process and simplifying the products will help with that, because no one loves to talk about their what student loans they get or what grants they're getting, or whether it's a loan or a grant and what that means and all of that. So kind of educating up front. Looking at the idea of getting better information out there, trying to help students and families pick a good institution for them. Again, going hand in hand with the financial literacy component of that, so that students have a process and kind of there's some thought in mind going forward as they're pursuing their post-secondary, so they have their goal in mind and they can kind of go through that hopefully in a positive way. And then also looking at this kind of, going back to the stackable credentials idea. So this is an area that we've been spending a lot of time kind of behind the scenes looking at. Are there things along the way that even at a baccalaureate program, that students can be getting, so that if they have to drop out because of a family emergency, or because circumstances get in the way, or life gets in the way, or whatever it is, which you're seeing more and more of now that you have what we call contemporary students, basically your non-traditional students who are now becoming the traditional students, enrolling in post-secondary education. These things get in the way, so are there things that universities can be doing to give them a piece of paper so that if they do have to stop out before they complete their final degree, they have a sense of accomplishment, they have a piece of paper that shows that they have learned something, and then they can go find a job with that piece of paper. And that's something that we're really focused on. So I think those three things, along with some of these other things that we've been kind of talking about, will really help move this conversation forward.
James, do you want to jump in there? Are you ready to move on to the next? No? Okay. We've talked a bit about need-based aid, and particularly the complexity therein. This notion that our systems almost seem designed to keep students out of college, as President Spellings remarked, I think is often the conclusion a lot of us come to. Judy Scott Clayton has a great memo in our series on simplification of need-based aid, and it goes beyond simplification of Fafsa. It says, let's get rid of Fafsa. We've got most of the information we need from the IRS. We could essentially do this automatically, right? Sort of check a box on a tax return and assess that need. She also has some sort of more interesting, not more interesting, but more dramatic, I think, ideas about assessing this once, so not having students do it every year. And as well, sort of setting an amount aside that a student could draw down on a per credit basis, right? As opposed to sort of, the rigmarole we run through with summer Pell being in place and then going away and being in place again and so on. So, Amy, I know you've done a lot of work on these issues and you're thinking about them. So what are the prospects for such dramatic simplification? And also want to think a little bit about, are there trade-offs that we need to be mindful of as we talk about simplification of need-based aid?
Right. So I think the idea of FAFSA simplification, and that conversation has been around for several reauthorizations now at this point. We absolutely simplified the FAFSA, except we made it a little bit more complicated in the last reauthorization. But we were down there simplifying, just to be clear. We may have added questions, but we were simplifying. And so I do think that, particularly with the advent of technology, I think both the previous two administrations did a lot of work to integrate, use technology to simplify the form and simplify the process that students have to go through. And at this point, I think the last I looked, we were at the 98, 97, 98, 99% of all borrowers filling out the FAFSA were filling them out online. So already there, if you're a low-income student, the skip logic that the department has put in place has helped you kind of speed through a lot of that. And I think the average time, again, the last time I checked, the average time to fill out a FAFSA was between 20 and 30 minutes. Not terrible, frankly. So I think for lower income students, the form itself is actually not too terrible. It's scary and it's hard to kind of get your head around because you hear all the time, oh, it's just like filling out your taxes. Oh, it's so complicated. I think with the DRT tool, which is now back up and running, I think that has also helped significantly in that. So I think all of those things are very positive. I hesitate to try to scale back so significantly and get this idea of FAFSA on a postcard or whatever you want to call the kind of catchy phrase, because you start to then lose the specificity that you need to really ensure that aid is targeted. In addition, and I know Judy Scott Clayton talked about this in her paper, I am concerned about kind of the proliferation of forms at different levels. Yes, elite institutions might use their separate forms already. Okay, that's fine. That's not where most students are going, frankly. So I do get concerned that if we scale and scale and scale and scale back and get it just on a form, that then states and institutions are going to be sending things out. So I do get nervous about that. But this is definitely going to be an ongoing topic as we move forward. I think there's also an element, frankly, of personal responsibility that a lot of our members feel out there. If we as the government are going to be giving and investing in students, there should be, it's not too much to ask for students to actually fill out some questions and put it forward and fill it out in a timely manner, things that are going to be required of them as they enroll in school, as they get out into the workforce, those types of things as well. So,
James, I know that the prior year was a large priority of the administration, the prior administration. So how do you feel about where we are in terms of simplification and the prospects for more?
I think we've made a lot of progress. It started in the Bush administration, continued into the Obama administration, and as Amy said, the time to fill out the form has been cut from an hour to 20 minutes or so. It's that's 20 million bottles of Advil a year or something. So that's progress. And I thought that Judy had some very thoughtful ideas that are worth considering. It seems to me that you do want to build it around the IRS data. It seems to me that whatever data the IRS has that can help us better target, we should use. It doesn't increase burden at all. But I also think that we should put efforts to simplify the form in context. What students really need to know is how much college will cost them. So now they don't even know how much aid they will get. Helping them figure out easily how much aid they'll get is a step in the right direction, but the actual end of the day, they need to help figure out how they're going to pay for it all. So we need to be thinking about more transparent college pricing, helping them access better information on net price. The other thing about prior, there is good evidence that it has impacted students' applications, and that it's been working in the field. There's some suggestion that it has benefited higher income students more than lower income students because they are better able to apply sooner and get a greater share of the scholarship funds. So we need to make sure that we are following through on these new tools and making sure that the information is getting in the hands of students that need it.
Mm-hmm. The point about states and their ability to use the information that's furnished by FAFSA is an important one. I think one that doesn't often get enough appreciation. Most state aid programs run on data that they are able to retrieve from FAFSA. In the spirit of bipartisanship, just on the loan repayment and the need-based aid platform, a Republican presidential candidate did propose similar ideas, something like a $50,000 line of credit for that would be repaid as a function of your income, proportional to how much you drew down. Don't forget that. That's out there. That's still out there and waiting to be picked up and run with. So please think about that. Moving on, I see Robert Kelton in the audience, so I want to make sure we acknowledge Robert's paper and his excellent work on accreditation. It's sort of an evergreen in many respects. I remember when I was writing about accreditation in my former role, and I went back and actually looked through various testimony and policy briefs and so on from mid-'80s, people were saying the same things about accreditation that they are today. So the question I have is, they're not new, but they've certainly gotten louder, it seems to me, and louder from both sides of the aisle. And so, Amy, a question for you. is the need for change to the accreditation system and the way the federal government relies on it, is it more acute now than it has been in the past? And if so, why? And what are the options there?
Yeah, so I think, we've talked about a lot about accreditation previously. I think in past reauthorizations, it's been a lot about transparency. It hasn't been about like just the actual function of an accreditor. But you are hearing more and more, as we're talking about the conversation around accountability, about what the accreditor's role is. You have lots of proposals, different proposals out there about what to do about accreditors, whether it be, give them more teeth, don't give them any teeth, decouple student aid. There are lots of ideas out there. I do think right now accreditors are asked to do a bit too much. They are supposed to be, if you look back at the kind of accountability system or paradigm that is set up in the HEA for institutions of higher ed, accreditors are supposed to be that quality control piece. And we've gotten them caught up over the years in looking at other types of compliance, things that the department should be doing, things that the state should be doing. So I think what we really need to do moving forward is have them hone in and really focus on quality control. Largely, I think accreditation is doing what it is supposed to. It was set up to do. It's supposed to be peer review, trying to get institutions to approve. And the challenge that accreditors often face is improve. The challenge that accreditors often face, though, is if they either want to shut down an institution or they come down hard on an institution, they then get political pressure, to keep the institution open because folks may not like higher ed as a group, but their institution is great. So I think that becomes some of the challenge.
Same with Congress.
Always. All of Congress is great. So I do think trying to let accreditors kind of do their job is going to be really helpful. I also think that accreditors are like any other regulated entity. If they have Congress, if they have the feds, if they have other folk, the states even, coming down on them and slapping their hand when they try, because the other thing we've heard a lot about is accreditors often kind of disrupt innovation, and they don't allow innovation to move forward. If accreditors feel like they're going to get their hands slapped by someone, then they're not going to do it. And so I think trying to give them a signal that we do want them focused on quality, we do want them working on those types of issues, I think will help free them up to actually do just that, and then allow for some of these more innovative things to kind of move forward.
James, your thoughts? I know there was some frustration on the part of the administration, the prior administration, about sort of lack of oversight by some accreditors of a particular part of the higher ed spectrum, the for-profits in particular. There's a great paper by Steph Cellini and Corey Codell as well on this sector. But where do you think we are on accreditation? Is the need for reform more acute today than it has been?
I agree with Amy. I think it is both too loose and too tight in that it keeps colleges from doing things that have potential to help students learn more at lower cost. And at the same time, it fails to protect students and taxpayers when students aren't learning and are paying too much. And so, I think it is, I think that challenge is shared by the Department of Education rules and by the state oversight process. But, I think that we need to be thinking more about how to incorporate student outcomes into this process. And that doesn't mean that accreditors should be saying that students need to be earning X dollars or the program loses accreditation. I'm not saying that. But I would think that, if there's evident in the data a sudden rapid decrease in employment outcomes from a particular program, we would want colleges to say, okay, we're going to consider that data. Has there been a change in the quality of the program? Has there been faculty turnover? Or is this due to external economic conditions? And if it is external economic conditions, are we expecting the fracking industry or whatever to bounce right back? Or do we need to reconsider the value proposition that we're offering to students? So again, not a bright line. I think the nice thing about accreditors is that they are best suited to do this in a sophisticated, nimble well-calibrated way, which is much more difficult for the federal government and the state governments to do. I think that would be a way to think about trying to focus their efforts on whether institutions are getting students where they want to go.
Mm-hmm. I do think James's point, maybe to remember too, that I do think accreditors are recognizing that the spotlight is on them too. I mean, you've seen accreditors, WASC in particular comes to mind, that has really pushed to really focus on the outcomes, to James's point. Because that's something, I mean, that's across the board things that members still like to talk about, right? Accreditation shouldn't be about counting the books in the library and the number of faculty you have, but actually looking at student outcomes. So I do think the accreditors are heeding that call more so than they have historically in the past, and they've come out with common definitions and things like that to try to ease the transparency or make the transparency better, those types of things.
Mm-hmm. I want to make sure we open it up for questions. I think we've got about 15 minutes left. Yep, I see a sign that says move to Q&A. I'm good at following directions. That's one thing you can say about me. A reminder, you can send questions in if you're online to events@urban.org. So any questions out there, please wait for the microphone, identify yourself by name and affiliation. I'll go through my whole AEI spiel, which I haven't done in a while. No speechifying. Yeah, go ahead.
I am Frank Ballman with the National Association of State Student Grant and Aid Programs. And in terms of state aid programs, they're not always partisan. If you look at states, Tennessee Promise was passed by a purely Republican legislature and governor. And maybe even more significantly, need-based aid in Texas was passed by a Republican governor, Republican legislature. And I think the key here is in both cases there's an alignment with the Chamber of Commerce is saying we need this. How would you engage the Chamber of Commerce at the federal level to highlight that there's 6 million empty jobs in America every month? We need people who have 21st century skills to fill those jobs.
Well, the person who is probably best qualified to answer that question has departed, unfortunately, because President Spellings, of course, spent many years at the Chamber after her tenure as Secretary. I do think, I generally think the Chamber is engaged. I think the National Chamber is engaged on issues of education and workforce development. I did some work a long time ago on public systems of post-secondary education on behalf of the Chamber. I know they've been deeply involved in conversations around quality assurance reform. Again, in the spirit of bipartisanship, bringing in different parts of the aisle. I think that, just to sort of editorialize for a second from the seat I currently sit in, I do think that that policymakers, in some respects, are asking for more evidence than just the status quo. And I think the status quo is that Pell Grants are a pretty good investment and that we reap a pretty good return on that investment. I don't think anybody, I think there's maybe some disagreement on the margins about that, but I think that's sort of baked in the cake. I honestly think that's the baseline from which policymakers make the investment every year. I think the same is true for state policymakers. The investments they make in higher ed, despite the rhetoric around state disinvestment, are still substantial, right? I mean, especially in a state like the one that I work in now. So I do think that a lot of this is, it's not enough to dust off kind of the old yellowed notes, right, from the economic impact study that you did 15 years ago, right, and say, see what a great investment this is. I think it's about saying, in an era of competing priorities, what have you done for us lately, and what are you doing to go above and beyond what the baseline is? And so I think it's incumbent on all of us, and we talk about this a lot in the work that we do now. Some of this is about telling the story, like the first panel talked about, more effectively, and saying, here's how we're making these dollars go even further. And I think that's a key part of the politics of this, right? It's not necessarily just about technical and technocratic policy design. It's also about understanding the politics, I think.
I think, Frank, one thing that is interesting about this set of issues now is, on the left, people talk about disparities by race, by income, and challenge of student debt affordability. On the right, people talk about ROI, college value, economic development. What's interesting is there's a lot of common ground in the solutions, whichever of those problems you are most concerned about. So that's, makes me feel that this whole area is one that really is susceptible to thinking across party lines about solutions that will help us achieve better student outcomes. And so I think, you do need to tailor a little bit which you put first depending on the audience, but I think that there is a lot of potential here to have a pretty broad coalition behind some of these ideas.
Questions? Steve.
Steve Crawford at GW Institute of Public Policy. We've heard Sandy talk about how information isn't sufficient by itself. We need nudges. We've heard about targeting federal aid, which is the biggest sort of policy lever out there, more effectively. And we've heard interesting comments about identifying institutions with value added. Is there some way we could use the big federal aid system to not just better target students who need it, but better nudge them to choose institutions that will provide value added, the most value added, and maybe even more particularly provide value added for that kind of student who is filling out the FAFSA form? Is there any way to, it's almost like underwriting, I suppose, alone, but is there any way to think about using that big pool of money to incent better decision making?
So this question gave me some of my gray hair. I worked some on President Obama's college ratings plan. I think it is, and it's interesting that you come from a health perspective where some of that community is maybe a little further along in grappling with some of these questions. I think that it is very important to remember how diverse our system of higher education is. And it's very hard to design one set of metrics that appropriately recognizes all forms of excellence. And so, I think that, if my nephew were to go to some of the colleges that were at the top of the U.S. News rankings, I would think he made a good choice, probably. I think as a policymaker, I would like to see much more attention and investment in places like SUNY and CUNY and Cal State, community colleges, the places that are serving the vast majority of students from low incomes and students of color, and have much less resources to do it, and as a result get worse outcomes. And so I think that we do need some new measures that recognize the value add of those types of institutions. There also are, colleges that get federal financial aid to train students for the ministry or for graduate school, and I can tell you their employment outcomes don't look very good. So there's like a lot of different dimensions. I do think that we do need to think about the resources piece of this, because overwhelmingly resources in higher education are tied to enrollment, and that I believe makes it difficult for college administrators to make investments in quality. And we need to think about how successful investments in raising graduation rates and helping students succeed after they graduate are rewarded, as opposed to hoping that colleges will find ways to swim upstream from their economic incentives.
I think on that point, I think one of the more interesting conversations that we're having now, and I think it's informed by research by Dave Deming and some colleagues around, is it a better use of a marginal dollar to lower tuition by $1 to invest in something that's going to raise the quality of education? They find pretty convincingly that it's better to invest it on the quality side and not on the lowering of tuition. So so an important paper and set of discussions around the free college proposals in particular, I would say.
Right.
Any other questions?
But why is it either or?
Sure.
Right.
Sure. Yeah, I think.
Let's do both.
Well, I think that's fair. Yeah.
Right, Amy?
There is an economic model that you have to pay the bills at some point. So. Yes, David.
Hi, David Bain with the American Association of Community Colleges. So we've had a fair amount of discussion this morning about the resources available for higher education. And one of the things, of course, coming from the community college sector that we're acutely aware of is that we have fewer resources to educate our students on average than in other sectors, with students that are overall, in general, the least well prepared to succeed in post-secondary education. So the question I have for both of you, given your current and I guess previous positions as well, is if you assume that there's no greater resources overall for post-secondary education in the aggregate, across all institutions, and you also assume that, of course, there are interest groups such as mine that are pushing for their particular sector, whether it be at the federal level or the state level. What are the prospects for a broader discussion about the overall allocation between institutions, nationally speaking, at federal, state, and local levels? What do you think, maybe Amy, the awareness of the various subsidies are from members of Congress between the sectors? Because we don't necessarily see the pie growing, and we know, however, that certain institutions have a lot less to work with than others. So curious about your perspectives about whether there's prospect, I guess, A, for a good conversation about this or the awareness level about this, and B, maybe whether or not there might be any changes in this if people were to think that's desirable.
I'll recuse myself from this conversation. I'm glad to hear you, David, kind of articulate the recognition that there are limited, the pie is not getting bigger, right? It's just not. So I think it's going to be about, I think the conversation is absolutely going to be about how do we allocate those funds in a way that benefits, the students that we're trying to help. And the challenge in the HEA is that predominantly the funds flow to the students. There are some funds that flow to community colleges. There are some funds that flow directly to minority serving institutions. But other than that, those are the pots we can play with in those spaces. Other than that, the funds do flow to institutions. And so it's trying to figure out where the subsidies make sense to help try to incentivize kind of students getting in and now getting through, which is a new part of conversation that folks are really focused on here. So I do think the kind of time is now for having that conversation. I think it's going to be a tough one. I think it's really hard for us at the federal level in particular to try and set a policy across the board that differentiates different types of institutions, because every group comes in and has their story about why they need funds, or they're underfunded, or they're this, or they're that. I mean, every group has those stories, and so we at the federal level have to figure out a policy that's going to apply across the board. So I think that's where the challenge comes in, and moving forward. But I mean, it's definitely going to be part of the whole conversation. James, I know you're doing some work with the Raj Chetty group and the College Board, I believe,
That's right.
on mobility enhancing colleges. So how would you approach that question?
I mean, I do think that, my hope is that we as a community would be able to communicate to policymakers the central importance of community colleges and regional universities in serving the vast majority of students who are trying to move up into the middle class. And I think that, we need to convey much more respect for the mission of those institutions and invest in them commensurate with the importance of their mission. I think it is hard to think about redistribution, and I think those are kind of rocky shores. And, when we in the Obama administration thought about the different investments we made, they did, of course, have different sectoral implications. And so investing in Pell was a little different from investing in the American Opportunity Tax Credit, and very different from investing in income-based repayment loan forgiveness. Of course, we did prioritize community colleges a number of times. I think that, I think that it is hard to pit sector against sector, but I think that you can advance and sort of focus on policy aims that may not be neutral across the sectors, but focus on getting the results we want for the students we want.
Please join me in thanking Amy and James for being here.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank all of our speakers, President Spellings, everyone else. this was a great gathering, and I think that our purpose was, when we started this project, to try to bring people with different ideas together to have a constructive conversation, and I think that's really what happened today, and I'm very grateful for it. We don't see that very often in this day and age. I want to remind you all to go to the website and read the memos and read the framing paper, because I think they make a valuable contribution, and I really want to again thank Doug and Ted and Andrew and all the memo writers. This has been a great project working together. Thank you all.